Welcome everyone to Apocalypse Memed. I'm going to share my screen here real quick, and we're going to look at a couple of slides, but welcome to all of you that are joining us on Facebook, as well as joining us through the webinar. And we'll talk a little bit in just a second. In fact, I'll show you in just a minute here how you can join either way. But we're basically going to be looking at the characteristics of an apocalypse. And we're going to use primarily Revelation to do that, but we are also going to look at dynamics that are present in our current times and in many other times that we have as well. So, and we're going to use memes throughout to help illustrate that in a digital way, to give us a visual perspective of what characteristics of an apocalypse are, and what this means for us as people of faith, and how we can find hope in an apocalypse as well. You can join us two ways. One is to join us through Facebook Live, which many of you are probably doing right now, or you can join us through a webinar on Zoom. So if you go to https://zoom.us and then put in the webinar ID 936-7995-7360, you can join us through the webinar, which is actually how we're broadcasting right now. I will tell you that if you're on the Facebook Live portion, you'll see the lecture piece, which will last 20 to 30 minutes each of the sessions. And then we will stop that and then just be in the webinar for the question and answer portion. So if you just want myself, or in this case, I have a guest with us today, Pastor Michael Roberts is with us as well. If you just want to see that portion where we're talking, then Facebook Live is a perfect option. If you want to have an opportunity to ask some questions, then go ahead and plan to join us through the Zoom option, and that's the information that you will need in order to be able to do that. Okay, well, I will talk through what the flow for today is going to be, first is to discuss Michael and I are going to discuss the impact that Revelation has had on our lives, and then I'm going to talk about the 4 typical approaches to Revelation that people tend to take, and then I will mention what one we are going to focus on, what one we're primarily going to use. And then for those of you that hang around for the Q&A section, we're going to have a brief discussion of what happens when we take works such as this one that relies so heavily on symbolism, when we take it too literally, and the dangers of that. The reason that I'm not doing that in the lecture piece is because there's a video to show on that we would run into problems with rights if we showed it on Facebook. So you have to be in the Q&A section to get that piece. And so we'll talk about that. And then I want you to bring whatever questions you have specifically for Michael after what he has shared, because this is the week that he is with us. But then also I would love to hear what questions you have overall that you want us to cover in the course of the next 4 weeks following this. So, so that will happen in the Q&A section. Okay. So, as I mentioned, we're going to start out with a reflection on how Revelation has impacted your pastors' lives. These are a couple of memes just to talk about the idea that Revelation, that apocalypses tend to impact us. And for me, you'll understand the importance of using the Bible and sort of how it at first was a threatening space and then became a very safe and protective space for me. So that's why the lady's got the Bible strapped to her face on that one. But we're going to, like I said, share a little bit about our own journeys. And so I'm going to invite Michael to start that off by sharing a little bit about what Revelation's meant to you and how your just how it's impacted your life. So Michael, take it away.
Well, thank you, Michelle. It is good to be with you, and I think this is going to be a lot of fun. There are so many kind of misconceptions or different thoughts around this particular book of the Bible, so this will be fun for us to have a discussion around. Way before there was anything like a meme, like we would see on Facebook. There were other options that got at some of the same things. So some of you who are on this meeting may remember the name Hal Lindsey or the book Late Great Planet Earth. These were best sellers, and the pictures were all over the culture. And these particular understandings dealt primarily with revelation and with biblical prophecy. It was all about predicting the end of the earth, the late great planet Earth as we know it, and then about what was going to happen to us, depending on whether or not we were faithful. And there were some really kind of interesting things around that as well. So this kind of conversation was going on in our culture about the time when I first had an awakening to a desire to study the scriptures more fully. And with all of this going on, here I was wanting to study the scripture. So guess what I did? I dove into Revelation. Maybe not the smartest move at all, but I think that that's a very common move. In every generation, that's a common move for people who think they want to study the Bible all of a sudden, because there's this idea that this particular book of the Bible will serve as a fast track to answers, to solving big existential questions around the mystery of life. So a lot of people want to just kind of jump to this and get to those answers. So that's what people were doing and were selling, I might say, when I first started reading Revelation, and we still see this today. And I'll tell you that the answers they were giving were answers that had to do with, well, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. Here's what I want to say. As I first started reading this, even then, these answers came across to me as self-serving, as sensational, as false. And I think if we want to kind of dive into some relevance here, I think we can compare some of the answers I was hearing then with some of the conspiracy theories that we hear today, and how people so want to believe these things because they confirm these deep prejudices, these hidden desires that might be so deep in our psyche that we don't even recognize them. But it is these deep things in our psyche that can attract us to these kinds of theories, to these kinds of ways of understanding the scripture. So just to talk about how this impacted my life, and I'm thankful for this opportunity to reflect upon it, because I was so fortunate at the time to be in a church, the United Methodist Church, to be in a college environment, and through Wesley Foundation and through professors, and I was taking classes in Bible and religion at the time. All of this helped open up for me a whole new way of reading the scripture. So here's a bottom line of how I might want to say this. Through the reading of Revelation, through diving into the scripture and going to the very end to get those answers to these big existential mysteries, what I learned was how rich and meaningful scripture can be when we don't take it literally. When we let the scripture get inside us, rather than think about it as just something out there that we are learning about. It really means so much more when we view it more as a mirror than a window. We look through a mirror to discover what's going on out there. Maybe in the windows of time, we might say, where we figure out what Revelation says about history. When we look at it using the analogy of a mirror to see more about what's going on in here, as a mirror to our souls, then a whole new world opens up for us. And I would say what opens up for us is so much more profound than what we might see in these fantastical interpretations in our culture. Revelation is full of bizarre images and deep spiritualism. And we can read this and it might scare us off, but then for some, it also sparks bizarre fantasies to match the bizarre, bizarre images. People will share those things to make money, or perhaps to draw people into a circle so that they can share even more bizarre conspiracies about what they need to do with their lives. If we want to understand the power of symbolism in the Bible, Revelation is a good place to begin. Because we learn pretty quickly, if you immerse yourself in any kind of sound biblical scholarship, when it comes to interpreting symbols, we can't just do this arbitrarily. We can't just make stuff up about what this stuff might mean. Certainly not if we want to be faithful. I was thankful to learn how the symbols in Revelation, they come out of real life. They come out of a living community. And the meaning of these symbols, the meanings are available to all who are willing to be immersed in the community and in the language of faith that forms the community. So there's not some big secret code at all for those who are immersed in the community. I have learned to rarely trust, if ever trust, somebody who says, I know what it means. God has given me a special revelation. That's dangerous because the meaning comes through the community who already know what this means. So that if they see something like 7 lampstands, then they know the significance of this number 7 and the rich history that this number 7 has in the community. They know about the 7 candles on a Jewish menorah. They know the significance when you talk about the 7 churches of Asia, meaning the whole church, the complete church, all of the dynamics of the church. When they read about a lamb, it's not some secret hidden meaning at all. This symbol is rooted in the sacrificial system and describes something about who Jesus is to us. When they heard about Babylon, they understood it to be Rome, especially when the kind of obvious hints are given about it being a city of 7 hills. I mean, this is just kind of some obvious stuff if you were immersed in the community. So this isn't secret. This is a resource to help us grow in faith. I could go on and on. I'm not, Michelle, you can stop me if you want to, and we can pick up some other topics, or I can just kind of keep going.
I think that's a really good a place to bring up. You made me think about a lot of things, including my own work on my dissertation. And I worked with a scholar named Wolfgang Iser, and he talks about how you can't just make words make sense out of nothing, right? Every meaning is seated in a reality, and you have to understand that reality. Now, your reality may shift, your language does evolve and move, and one of the powerful things about Scripture, and I love that you brought up both this reality that Revelation is a product of a time and speaks specifically into a time, but also that Scripture is so meaningful to us when we take that meaning on and give it space to impact our hearts, right? And to shape our perspective and our world. And we're going to hold those two things in tension, and they don't have to contradict one another. They can both be very powerful realities that stand alongside one another. So I love that you framed both things there. I would like to share now at this point how Revelation has impacted me. Mine's very much a specific story that I have from my own faith journey. And what it was is I did not grow up in the church. I was I was everybody's project, in fact, in many ways. And so I was invited to a number of churches growing up. And as a youth, was often invited to things like lock-ins, right? This is where you'd bring your friends and invite them to come learn about your church. And it was kind of the thing that we did in the Bible Belt in particular. Much of our community revolved around church. And so I went to a lock-in where they showed a movie called A Thief in the Night. Now, those of you that are children of the 70s and 80s would be familiar with this movie. It was put together by some evangelical group, and it was what they like to say a literal representation of the book of Revelation. Now, that is not remotely the case. It is by all means an interpretation. And it was an interpretation out of a very particular way of approaching Revelation, right? So, but I didn't know that. I had very little familiarity with the Bible other than what I had experienced in the times that I'd gone to visit other people. And here was this movie that they showed to us. I was 12 or 13 years old. And for those of you that seen it, it's very much in that Left Behind kind of mythology around Revelation. And so at the very beginning, certain people just get raptured away. And then there are all these good people that they focus on that had never accepted Jesus Christ. And things just go awfully for them, including up to at the end, those that won't take on the mark of the beast or whatever, get beheaded. This is not a cheery it's not even really great for, I don't think, 13-year-olds to watch. So certainly not 13-year-olds in the 80s. And so here was this terrible, violent show. And I was absolutely convinced that night that I was going to be one of the good people left behind, because I had not, despite the fact that I'm sure there was an altar call, and I'm sure they meant me to, give my life over to Christ. I didn't do it at that point. I had a lot of questions, in all honesty. And so I did not do that. But then I was in this panic that I was going to be one of the good left behind people. And for a little while, I was terrified. And then I was angry. And I honestly said, why in the world would anyone worship a God that would do this to people? If that is the destiny that is before us, who is following this God? And that was the moment. I like to say that was the razor. I was walking on a razor's edge, and I was either going to tip to being an atheist or I was going to tip to being a pastor. It was not going to be a little in between journey for me, because it was such an extreme moment. And so what I decided to do in that moment was to read the Bible. It's funny, you dove into scripture too, right, Michael? And so I decided to read the Bible, because I was tired of being told what was in it and not knowing. And so I started reading the Bible. I read one chapter a day, every day, except on Sunday I read 2. That was my going to church. I prayed the Lord's Prayer every night. I had a bookmark with it on there from my grandmother. In the course of the 3 years that it took me to read the Bible, from age 13 to age 16 is how long it took. In the course of that time, I had some very profound encounters with scripture. I had my heart strangely warmed moment in Hebrews 11. I had profound experiences around the parable of the mustard seed in 2 of the Gospels, and finished that journey in love with God, in love with the Bible. And still a little hesitant about the church. It would take me a little while to get there, but so convinced. And by the time I reached Revelation, once I had run the entire stretch of scripture, by the time I reached Revelation, it was the great ending to the story. And so much hope in it. And that's what I see in Revelation. And so, and since then, I've had the privilege of teaching Revelation. So for the past 6 years, I've taught in Dallas for course of study. In fact, Sharon, who's on here on the Zoom piece, is one of my students from that. I've had the opportunity to teach Acts, Epistles, and Revelation in course of study at Perkins School of Theology in Dallas for 6 years. And I absolutely love teaching Revelation. It is the funnest session that we have. We do 2 sections on Revelation. I give a lot of the background and go into the symbolism and all that, but then we spend all this time looking at how Revelation shows up in pop culture. And my students always come into that class asking me why we have to do Revelation, because they're scared of it. They don't like the interpretation that's got the press out there. They hate having to deal with it with their parishioners. They feel overwhelmed by it and intimidated by it. And I'm like, just hold on, come with me. It is going to be great. We are going to have the best time in Revelation. And so that is what drives me to bring this book to folks in a bigger sense. And we will be looking at Revelation in kind of a broad view. We can't, in the course of 5 weeks, it's really hard to dig deep into the symbolism, but we will be hitting the high points. So Michael, any other thoughts, comments before I share a little bit more about how we're going to approach Revelation?
Yeah, it is a book of hope. It is such a book of hope. In the very first verse, we're told that what this is all about. It's about a testimony of how to Jesus Christ, of how Christ is alive and able to overcome all evil, all sin, all death. And that's what it's about. It is that good news that sees us through any struggle. And in the case of the original hearers, deep, deep persecution. And while it's not necessarily about the future only in this world, it is about the ultimate reality for all of us, where we are with God and with one another in a community that is bigger than we could ever count. And I love that as well, where death and hell are destroyed.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Not where we're destroyed, but where death and hell are destroyed.
Right, because we go on in this new heaven and new earth, right?
Yeah.
And, I mean, which is here, which is another profound, powerful thing to affirm. Yeah.
So there are scary moments throughout, but there's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
But it is a beautiful book of hope.
It is that. So there are 4 typical approaches to Revelation, the kind of broad stroke approaches to Revelation. And I want to point you all to this book. I'm going to show this to you here, and then I'll show you a slide that has the details on it. But it's actually not a book, it's a pamphlet called Understanding the Book of Revelation, and it's put out by Hendrickson Publishers and Rose Publishing. And this is what I love about it. First of all, it fits inside most Bibles, but then it folds out. And it takes the 4 approaches, which I'm going to define for you in just a minute, which is historicist, preterist, futurist, and idealist, and then takes the entire book and talks about how each of those approaches would come at each section of the book. It also, in the back, or on the flip side, has kind of some of the major breakdowns of the book. So it breaks it into the big chunks of it, and then gives several definitions. You might have heard terms like premillennialism, postmillennialism. Those are all amillennialism. Those are defined here. It talks about certain terms that get a lot of press, like 666 and 144,000. And this is just a fantastic resource. So let me share my screen again and let you see the details on that. So let me skip forward. This is what it looks like. I did order a few of them to come into the church. So for those of you that are part of First United Methodist Church of Conway, we have a pile that's coming in. It'll literally cost you $4 on Amazon. Plus, if you've got Amazon Prime, it's free shipping. But if not, there may be a little bit of shipping cost to it. But I really, really recommend that you get this just because it's so helpful. But I want to talk to you a little bit about the 4 ways that we're interpreting Revelation and which one we're going to primarily focus on. So the first 3 that I'm going to talk about are historicists. So the historicist is Revelation occurs from the 1st century to current days. So a historicist approach to Revelation is this idea that the apocalypse started unfolding in shortly after Jesus was killed and runs all the way up to now. And these are the ones that keep having to say, this is where you get this, well, the end of the world is upon us, and then it's not. And then so we say, okay, well, that wasn't quite the end of the world, but now is the end of the world. and all of this was leading up to it. And so they keep having to interpret the whole of human history based on where we are now. And this is really where that left behind approach tends to come from. It tends to be a blend of historicist and futurist. And so that's one approach to Revelation. Another approach to Revelation is the preterist, which is that Revelation only concerns events of the 1st century. So all that matters to it is that this took place. This was persecution of Rome, persecution of the Christians under Rome, and that's why it's in there. And again, I think the point that Michael makes is a good one, which is that it is very important to understand that historical time frame and the context that gave rise to the book of Revelation. However, we have made it scripture, and so scripture has impacts for us. So how do we hold that in balance with that as well? Then the futurist approach is just that Revelation is a prophecy primarily about the end of the world. It didn't have anything to do with the 1st century, which is then that takes it out of its historical context, and so there's some struggle with that. And again, the left behind approach tends to borrow some from the futurist perspective as well. But the one that we will primarily focus on, with some reference to the preterist, right? Some reference to it is important to understand the context in which Revelation was created. The one we will primarily use is the idealist, which is this idea that Revelation does not occur at one particular preordained time, but works anytime someone is experiencing spiritual and physical oppression. And that's what I want us to claim in this space, is that Revelation does have value now because it does in many ways show a pattern for what happens when somebody is going through something very hard, or some community is going through something very hard, or some country is going through something very hard, or some world is going through something very hard. Revelation spells out a pattern for some things that are going to be common to that experience, and always, especially for people of faith, finds the hope within it. Yes, acknowledges the challenge. Yes, acknowledges that there's some difficulty. Yes, acknowledges that there's going to be loss and pain, and even in some cases violence. But claims the hope on the other side of that. So that's what we're primarily going to be looking at. And that's why it seems so poignant for now, because we are in a time of challenge and struggle. And so what can we learn? What does Revelation help us do as we're going through our own personal apocalypses, or our large scale apocalypses like it feels like we're in right now? So okay, we are getting ready to switch to the question and answer piece. So I'm going to share one more time the slideshow, or the slide that allows you to see, if you want to join us in the Q&A section, how to do that. So let me get to that. And here we go. So again, just go to zoom.us, type in the webinar 936-7995, and that should bring you into the portion of the webinar for the Q&A section. For those of you that just wanted to be part of the lecture piece, it was great seeing you. I've had fun looking at all the folks that are joining us on Facebook. And again, feel free in that thread to share any questions that you have, even if you're not staying for the Q&A section, and I can hopefully address them in coming weeks. And I encourage all of you to read chapters 1 through 3 of Revelation for next week. That will be primarily what we will be looking at. So thank you all so much for being with us that are on the Facebook Live portion. Those of you that are in webinar, we're coming back. I just need to stop the live stream. But blessings for those of you that are out there on Facebook.